Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council. With our final podcast of 2021, I can't believe it. What a year it's been. And joining us today will be Elleithee, the founding executive director of Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Service, which he launched in 2015 after 2 decades as a communication strategist in the Democratic Party, working with people like Hillary Clinton. He's also a Fox News contributor, so he's fair and balanced in his approach to ideas. And we look so much forward to speaking with him about the state of foreign policy and its relation to domestic politics, and how much the BidenHarris administration has done or not done over this past year. But before we get there into our final podcast, Nick, I wanted to talk about something that really got my attention over the last 2 days, which is the International Rescue Committee's report on the humanitarian crises around the world, which we've tried to bring to light with our podcasts on Afghanistan and on Haiti. And yet somehow this global system failure is not resonating. And I was really struck by the Miliband, the head of the IRC, was saying that there are 55 civil wars brewing around the world. 55. And I just thought, my God. And later on in the podcast, you'll hear Mo talk about the fact that a survey he recently took has Americans thinking that we're almost on the brink of civil war. And what are your thoughts first on this idea of all these civil wars brewing that we're not talking about? What's going on, one, and two, this idea of a global system failure, and why aren't we talking about Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Yemen, which were, by the way, their top 3 countries that need help?
Well, to start with the question of global systemic failure, we are in a period of transition. The post-Cold War era is over. The assumptions, we're celebrating in a week, 30th anniversary of the collapse, dissolution of the Soviet Union. And 30 years ago, there was a great deal of optimism. We were on the verge of a new world order, as then President Bush put it. We've kind of come to the end of that cycle. And there's been some successes, been some failures. I think something that Mo has been talking about it's no longer about left and right. It's about those that are at the front of the line and those that are at the back of the line. And I think a lot of this tension is due to the fact that people who have been at the back of the line don't think that they have a pathway to the front, or that all a rising tide will lift all boats. Democracy will solve all of our problems. Globalization will solve all of our problems. And so those tensions are there. Plus new technologies, disruptive technologies that have changed the way, in positive ways and in negative ways, how people communicate, how they work, how they obtain a livelihood. But there's a lot of tension. Add to it the global pandemic, which again also aided and abetted by globalization. The way how it spreads is very much due to the fact that we're an interconnected world in a way that we weren't even 30 years ago. And so all of this creates this tension that I think we're working our way through. To this point about why the coverage and where's the interest, I think this also points to an end that there is a fatigue. People are tired, they're exhausted. And what I mean in countries like the United States, it's a sense that after decades of trying to improve places around the world, a sense that none of this works. This is the legacy of 20 years and billions of dollars spent in Afghanistan, and then to leave Afghanistan the way we did in 2021, and then saying what we're going to fix or be able to find solutions to these other crises. I think what you're having, and it may sound callous, particularly at a time of the holiday season when we're encouraged to think about giving and compassion, that people have reached a point to say, these problems are perennial, they can't be solved, and so why even bother trying? Somalia, again, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, famine breaks out, this massive international humanitarian effort, and people are, Ethiopia, Christmas time, that was the whole "do they know it's Christmas time," which was 36 years ago. And people are saying, and now in 2021, Somalia, Ethiopia, these places are still on the list. Well, maybe it's not worth it to try. And that has implications, by the way, moving forward for humanitarian aid, but also for the appetite people will have to go around and to try to help in these various places.
I hope that the future of our looking at these countries is not as cynical, and the IRC is really trying to bring this to light, and so hopefully we'll hear more about these countries and these issues, and perhaps dedicate a podcast in 2022 to how humanitarian organizations are responding in this changing world. I think it's a really important topic. You also made me feel really old with those references. Thanks a lot. But who might step in to the void if America really is going to pull back? Maybe. We just had a big meeting between Putin and Xi today, which hasn't gotten a lot of press, but really struck me as so important and interesting because of this quote. I have to read it to you so I get it right. But Putin said, "A new model of cooperation has been formed between our countries based, among other things, on such principles as not interfering in each other's international affairs, respect for each other's interests, determination to turn the shared border into a belt of eternal peace and good neighborliness." Putin, 2021. What do you think that was about? That is coming right after some pretty key moves. China's upset with the US about not being invited to the Summit for Democracy, about the diplomatic boycott of the Beijing 2022 Olympics. And all of a sudden, Putin and China are having a love fest?
Well, again, 30 years ago, Soviet Union collapsed. The sense was the United States sat at the center of the international system. All roads would come to Washington. This was the era of the end of history, where we were told that everyone was going to be on the same path towards liberal democracy, free market economics. And now, essentially, Putin and Xi are saying this really, it is a bookmark to what happened 30 years ago, saying, okay, that era is over. Not all roads lead to Washington. Washington doesn't necessarily have the tools to success. Remember, it was the era of the Washington Consensus. This is how these are the policies countries were expected to do to become prosperous. And now it is a case of Russia and China saying, we have an alternative, and saying to other countries, if you don't like the United States or what they're doing, you now have an alternative. We have a model. We are going to do these things, and it puts the United States, in essence, on notice that we are moving into a new era. From a doorstep perspective, what is quite interesting is in the Cold War, there was a sense that the Soviet Union was an existential threat to the American way of life, right? That left to their devices, if they could, the Soviets would come into the United States, they would dismantle the political system, they would nationalize industries, they would take over, and that was what mobilized the doorstep. Today, if Americans look and say, well, all right, Russia, China working together, good neighborliness, Belt and Road, but if this means I'm still getting goods at Walmart and Dollar Tree and Costco, and gas is at a decent price, and I'm not worried about Chinese and Russian paratroopers coming into my hometown, is there going to be a sort of similar reaction? And I think that, this is, it's an important question for us to keep looking at. Certainly the policy establishment is worried about China. Americans may be worried about China, but for different reasons, and it may not be that this really creates all that much sense of angst if there's not a sense that how this might negatively impact us in our pocketbooks, at the gas pump, and in what we choose to buy as gifts for this holiday season.
Well, to your point, Nick, we're going to be speaking with Mo about how domestic concerns and foreign policy concerns go together or not in a moment. Thank you so much for joining us, Mo. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today and our audience about what were the most important news stories of 2021 and how they impacted our audience and our everyday American citizens. We are particularly interested in looking at Biden-Harris policy for foreign policy for the middle class. What does that mean? Maybe if we could just take it from the top. You have so much experience in messaging. What do you think that really means, on the ground, and how can we make people understand it better?
Well, first, thanks for having me. And I'm going to take a step back, right? Because I think it's important to understand the moment we're in politically, and then how that translates into the foreign policy. Look, I think we're in the midst of a global populist era. And I think about populism a little bit differently than maybe others do. People are frustrated with institutions everywhere. They believe that institutions are failing them. In fact, I chastise my former colleagues who still work in politics, who are trying to still have debates, on this left versus right paradigm, because I don't think that's where anybody else is. I don't think the paradigm is still left versus right. The real paradigm today, in my opinion, is front versus back. People who are at the front of the line versus those who feel like they are stuck at the back of the line and just can't get ahead. And these people who feel like they are at the back of the line are frustrated, they are angry, and they have lost trust in every major institution. If you were to poll Americans today on what institutions they trust, there are only two institutions that have a net positive trust rating: firefighters and the military. Everybody else is underwater. And so understanding that, and understanding that this moment has been 40, 50 years in the making, with people going back to the Watergate and Vietnam era, increasingly losing faith in government, in Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, in the media, in academia, in virtually every major institution. The Biden-Harris administration came in with a lot to do in the middle of a global pandemic, trying to reestablish America's footing on the global stage and re-engage in a way that sort of reasserted its leadership role, and an American public that didn't really care about what was happening overseas because they were so frustrated with what was happening here at home, and they saw a disconnect. And so I think the Biden-Harris administration came in with this framing of a foreign policy for the middle class to try to make their foreign policy an extension of their domestic policy, to make their foreign policy as responsive to that concern that people have, that no one's looking out for me, making sure that they understood that our re-engagement on the global stage could benefit them in their day-to-day lives, which was people's biggest concern, that we were spending all this energy and time worrying about people overseas when we were struggling so much here at home. And so a lot of it was just a framing of why it was important to them. Have they been successful? I think it's still a little too soon to tell. But I think they've had some successes, and I think they've had some real challenges, which I'm sure we'll get into. I'm not convinced that a year in, or nearly a year in, that the general public looks around and says, yeah, I get it. Our foreign policy is going to help me in my day-to-day lives. I don't think they're there yet. And I think they have some, in some areas, they might feel a little bit better. In some areas, they might feel a little bit worse. And that's something that they're going to have to focus on moving forward.
Just listening to your comments here, I have to ask whether or not Secretary of State Tony Blinken consulted you prior to his speech in Jakarta, because what you've just laid out here are some of the themes. Listening to his speech earlier at ASEAN in Jakarta, where he talked about at several points, he talks about, we want good jobs at good wages. Our partnerships with our partners in the Indo-Pacific and with Europe will produce good paying jobs at home. He didn't necessarily use the front and back formulation directly, but he had a reference to that, where he talked about, as we kind of return to a globalized world of prosperity, we must not forget those. Not everyone is going to have their boat lifted by the tide, so we have to remember them. So to what extent do you see these themes, at least rhetorically, that you've laid out, are in fact making their way through into policy documents, strategy documents, as we move forward?
Look, I think both the Trump administration and the Biden administration are remarkably attuned to this as a global dynamic, because it is a global dynamic, this front versus back reframing, this populist era. We saw it, we've seen it in our politics for the better part of a decade. We've seen it in politics elsewhere. Look at Brexit in the UK. Look at the French elections. We could look at elections throughout Europe. We could look at certainly in Latin America, where you've seen this dynamic play out to different ends. The Trump administration saw it and used it to their political advantage, right? To take a more to sort of retreat, to bring us to focus us more inward. I think the Biden administration is taking it in the opposite direction. They get this dynamic just as much as the Trump administration did, but they see it as an opportunity to reassert America's leadership abroad. The challenge is the American people aren't 100% there yet, right? We are very divided domestically about how much we want to be engaged overseas, what our role is overseas. Everyone wants America to be a leader, but they define that a little bit differently, and a significant portion of the country does believe we need to be more inwardly focused. So it's a tight rope for the administration to have to walk. They understand the importance of America's engagement abroad. They understand that this dynamic is everywhere and we've got to address it. But at the same time, they're facing some really challenging domestic political considerations that they're going to have to reckon with as they move forward.
And I think to your point, I'm going to, talking about messaging, they might get it. It might be in their policy documents to have this, assertive policy to re-engage, but I think they're not selling it. So, there was this great summit for democracy. On paper, it sounded fabulous, but the marketing of it, the branding of it, it didn't stick. It didn't stick with the younger generation that I work a lot with, and I don't know what you both have heard, but it didn't resonate. It was a big Zoom screen of 130 countries. Some suspect, I'm going to call out one, the Philippines, invited to a summit of democracy, when in fact, who won the Nobel Peace Prize this year? Maria Ressa, who has been consistently fighting for freedom of the press and against oppression of the regime in the Philippines. So, I think that the messaging, the branding is not working because maybe they're trying to do too much. I don't know. I'm positing it out there for you to comment on. What do you think, Mo?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you're right. That didn't stick for a number of reasons. Number one, again, is that consistent with a foreign policy for the middle class, right? Does the middle class sit around and think about what's the state of democracy abroad? Probably not. But secondly, I think there's a lot of people in this country who, are wondering how fragile democracy is here at home. We're still reeling from January 6th. Do we still have the moral authority to be able to define the parameters of what makes a good democracy anymore. You know, we do polling out of our institute that tracks voter attitudes towards polarization, domestically focused. On a scale of 0 to 100, how bad do people see the polarization here in our country? 0 being no polarization at all, 100 being brink of civil war. The mean response right now is 76, right?
Wow.
Americans believe we are 3/4 of the way to civil war. And so I agree with you that Summit for Democracy may not have been the thing that really popped, you know, here. Having said that, I do think that there was a decent amount of excitement, at least in significant portions of our population, with our re-engagement on climate, right? And America's role at you know, in Glasgow, and just once again taking on a leadership role. So, you know, is the messaging working? I think in some areas, sure. I think in other areas, we got a ways to go.
I'm going to bring in the elephant in my room, which is China, because I think their messaging this year, I'm going to say, it has been fantastic. The New York Times just did a big piece on how China is influencing the influencers, as the headline, and speaking about their strength in promoting their messaging, you know, a consistent messaging of, you know, we're bringing prosperity to our people, you know, it's great here, you know, the West is wrong to criticize us because look at you, at your prison system, at your racism, at your, you know, persecution of Julian Assange. You know, who are you to be an exemplar of democracy? We just have a different great system. And I'm wondering what you think of our response to China and how that's resonating with, you know, the people that you're polling. You know, is the message that, you know, we need to do something about China there, or are people just happy to continue to buy from China because it's cheaper in an era where prices are totally out of control?
Yeah, and I don't think those are mutually exclusive, right? I do think that the American people get that China is a threat, that it is from a security, from an economic perspective, maybe one of our, you know, greatest rivals, and that being tough on them is important. At the same time, with inflation where it is, you know, I don't think they want anything that's going to further drive prices up. I don't think the Trump administration's trade policies were particularly popular, right? That starting a trade war was not particularly popular. So I think people like to say, yeah, we need to get tough on China, but what that means, nobody really knows. They don't like the idea of another country surpassing the United States as a global leader, but how to deal with that, most people have no idea. I think 2020 and 2021 were great years for China, right? 2020 and 2021 in the United States were good years for China, right, in their messaging, because for a lot of the things you just talked about, the racial unrest in the summer of 2020, the 2020 presidential election, and the aftermath of that culminating in January 6th, and the relative numbers in COVID cases in the two countries, right? Those three things right there gave China tremendous talking points. And they were smart. They were smart in how they went about it. I spoke to a number of political leaders and political operatives in Eastern Europe in early to mid 21 who were telling us about the volume of vaccine China was sending into their countries, the vaccine diplomacy that they were doing at a time when we are struggling to get Americans vaccinated, right? China was serving the rest of the world, and they beat the United States to the punch in that. I think the United States has caught up and is getting a lot of its stuff out there, and but China certainly saw the opportunity. and seized on it, probably better than anyone else did. What does that mean for our domestic politics? I don't know. Again, I don't think China is a driving political, it's not a vote motivator here in the United States. People just want to believe that their government is not going to let China beat us. But again, how many people know what that even means? How it plays the rest of the world. I mean, that's the dynamic to watch over the next decade. Does China, begin to surpass us in on the world stage in terms of how it approaches building alliances and partnerships? We'll have to see.
Vote motivators. That's a great way to frame our discussion, I think. Is there any international issue that you do think might be a vote motivator as we go into midterms?
I think two. COVID and climate are probably the two biggest. Well, I'd say trade. Those are probably the big three. COVID, just because we are seeing that. I mean, we see it now. I mean, a lot of what's going to motivate people are the domestic dynamics. But as we have learned, we can't seal the border to the virus, and we see a spike, or a new variant, emerging in South Africa, and suddenly we're talking about bringing back mask mandates or shutdowns here in the United States, and people are exhausted. People are exhausted. You would think that if anything could unify and push through polarization, it would be tackling a global pandemic. It hasn't. It has only exacerbated some of our polarizations here in the United States. The only unifying piece is people's exhaustion with it, right? Even those who tend to identify as more progressive, who are more supportive of mandates, who are more supportive of some of the stricter measures, even those people are starting to get tired of dealing with it. And so how we respond both domestically and globally, I think, are going to impact how people, and the level of exhaustion people have could be a vote motivator. Number two, climate could be a vote motivator for both sides of the political equation here in the United States. 80% of the country, ballpark, believes that climate is a real problem, but have very different visions on what can and should be done about it. As the United States once again engages globally in this conversation after 4 years of sitting it out, I think young voters, who are the most motivated by climate politically, could be more engaged. But it's a different electorate that turns out in midterm elections than in presidential elections. The people who turn out in midterm elections are a little bit more nervous, particularly in an era of economic anxiety and inflation. If they see us taking measures that could further drive up prices or threaten certain industries that aren't just about jobs, they're about a way of life for many Americans, it could motivate on either side. And then third, trade and just general global economic issues and how that impacts some of the other things we were talking about. If our trade engagement ends up leading into further tensions with China and prices continue to go up, or if other global economic factors drive prices up, that is going to create a very, very, very challenging dynamic for Democrats headed into the midterms. So I think those are the three. And when you think about it, right, all three of those play right into the framing that we began this conversation with: foreign policy for the middle class. Those are all three issues that impact me at my kitchen table, impact me in my home, impact me at my job, far more than some of the more, bigger picture issues that that tend to dominate some headlines.
Yeah. That leads me then to a comment and question from my end, which is, we've talked about this narrative framing a foreign policy for the middle class, and yet two things. One is that it doesn't seem that the memo has really gotten through to the national security community, which still likes to view foreign policy as the grand chessboard, and we're moving pieces around the globe and not really worrying as much about the domestic implications. And then the other, as you were going through the three issues, I couldn't help but hear in those three issues that we have some profound policy tensions there that contradict each other. So we saw this with the Biden administration. BidenHarris goes to Glasgow and very forward-looking climate agenda, then turns around and says we need to release oil from the reserve. We need OPEC to produce more oil to bring gas prices down. China is a threat. We look at the potential for conflict over Taiwan, and yet American LNG shippers are sending record amounts of natural gas to China, and we continue to purchase large amounts of consumer goods from China. And here it does seem that narrative can't, so I guess the two points. First is that, the foreign policy community, do you think they've gotten the memo that really you got to think about what a foreign policy for the middle class looks like? And second, it does seem that some of these contradictions can't really be ironed out by a good PR campaign, that, finding a good slogan isn't going to get around the fact that climate, trade, COVID, you have some real issues where choices will have to be made. And it's not a question of coming up with a slogan, but coming up with, in fact, making those choices and sticking with them. What are you seeing in terms of how this discussion is shaping out?
Yeah, I don't disagree. And look, we are still in the midst of a global crisis. And in times of crisis, you've got to oftentimes compromise on your own values, your own agenda, as a political leader. Sometimes it's not always to everyone's good. It's not always to everyone's benefit. But if you look throughout history, we have made some pretty tough choices that were antithetical to what the stated objective, the stated goal, the stated policy plan was. And I think that's sort of where we are right now. This is a president who, during his transition, announced that climate was going to be a whole of government issue, that every single agency, every single department was going to be focused on climate, that reestablishing our leadership on this issue was going to be a top agenda, and we were going to have some pretty strict plans in place that were in order to begin to get us back on track. But in the middle of a global health crisis that has led to a global economic crisis and inflation on the rise, did he have a choice?
Yeah.
But to open up the oil reserve, right? None of this would matter, right? If none of this matters if he's a one-term president, and suddenly another Republican comes in who starts to pull back even further, who goes back to the Trump position on climate. If gas prices don't come down, the likelihood is much higher that he's a one-term president. So there's going to be some trade-offs, and a one step back in order to take the two steps forward down the road. And I'm sure that's what they are thinking. So yeah, I think there are going to be inherent tensions that that the current moment we live in are driving. You can't divorce the politics from the foreign policy. You just can't, when you're particularly in a moment of crisis. Now, to your other question, is the national security establishment getting it? Look, I don't think any establishment gets it, right? I don't think, again, our establishments generally, and not just government, not just this administration, are still living in some old school paradigm that's not the reality today. And, you know, I give credit to the last two presidents for trying to reorient the conversation in very different ways, right? I don't think the last president did it in a particularly productive way. I think he did it in a harmful way, but he at least began to reorient the conversation away from some of the old paradigms, because those old paradigms are why people have lost faith, right? We're not talking to them. We're not talking about them. We are talking about a global chessboard. And while I get it, right? Some of my old Georgetown international relations education stuck with me. I get it. But people aren't there. And we're just in a different era in terms of public engagement in these things. And in a world that is now so much more hyper connected, and with a media ecosystem that is so much more polarized, you know, how people internalize information, how they translate that information to their real worlds, and how that manifests itself in their political activity, like that counts for something, probably much more than it ever has in the past. And so trying to make all of this, taking it away from the grand chessboard and bringing it, or at least moving the chessboard to people's kitchen tables, like that's important.
As you're talking about moving chessboards to people's kitchen tables, I can't help but think that we have to utilize social media better, you know, and we have to, you know, for all the faults of social media and the media ecosystem currently, it's also operating on an old paradigm, right? Old institutions are still thinking, you know, people are reading and going to pay for you know, beyond the paywall. And, you know, a lot of young students of my students stop reading because there's a paywall, and that's bad, right? Because then they're not getting information, and they're getting information from, I'm going to go back to my TikTok influencer statement, and how China is really able to utilize them, and how the old paradigms aren't allowing us to kind of access people where they are. And frankly, they are on TikTok, they are on Instagram. And, you know, I think that even the foreign policy community needs to better engage with these social media tools where people, every person, you know, from grandma to your 11-year-old is on social media, getting information, assimilating information, thinking that they know everything. And I think that some more needs to be done on that front. I wonder how much you've looked at, you know, the media and, you know, I hate saying the media because, you know, then it's this monolith. It's not a monolith, but what can the media, you know, do better to help with messaging? Any recommendations on your end from what you see?
I mean, what can it do better? Everything, right? Like, I kind of feel like we almost need to like rethink the whole model, because it has changed, right? And you're right, it's not a monolith. Yet we kind of romanticize this. There was a small blip in our history where it was, you know, and, you know, with the beginning of television news, and we had these 3 networks and 3 anchors who every day would just kind of tell us what the world looked like, and then we could use that as a starting point for a discussion. That was a small blip in our history. Before television, our media was very polarized. It was all print, right? New York City had 7 different newspapers, and you knew someone's politics by which one they bought. And then after the first couple of decades of television, we started to find new ways to get back to that. First with talk radio, then with cable news, and now with the internet. And so we're not having unified conversations anymore. That's the first problem, right? We're not having unified conversations where if I'm watching one network, I am seeing one reality. If I'm watching another, I am seeing another. And that's doing a disservice. So that's number one. Number two, you know, social media was supposed to be this great democratization of media, giving everyone a voice, giving everyone a chance to be a journalist, a citizen journalist. And we've seen some benefit, where we've seen where that's played out, right? The Arab Spring, in many ways, was driven by citizen journalists who were being able to show the world what we couldn't see before in real ways. But it has also allowed for greater polarization, algorithmic driven polarization, where I don't even have a choice sometimes to see a different perspective because the algorithms are just pushing the same ones in front of me. And perhaps one of the greatest threats we face today, and that's the rise of misinformation, disinformation, some of which is state-sponsored. The misinformation, disinformation piece is real. It is, I think, one of the greatest threats to democracies everywhere, and one that we have no idea how to tackle. So maybe your next guest will have a better idea. Maybe you can find someone who can come in and solve that problem for us. But I do think you're right that government actors outside of China are not very good at this, and that there are lessons that can be learned from China, not from Russia, right? Like, we don't need to be going down the misinformation, disinformation route the way they do, which is one of the most sophisticated ones in the world. But the way there are opportunities to use social media, take the conversation to where people are using voices that are relevant to them. But that requires thinking about it differently. Too many places are using Twitter and Instagram as just a new medium to post their old press releases, and they think they're winning, not understanding that it's a different way to have the conversation. There are some media platforms that are getting very good and creative at this. Snapchat has a whole news division, which is very good at taking sort of the news of the day and making it relevant to their younger viewers. And those younger viewers are getting more news from Snapchat than they are from, that more young viewers watch Snapchat than watch any of the cable networks combined. And they do it differently. So I do think that everyone ought to sort of take a beat. Now, I will say the Biden campaign was pretty good at this. And the Biden White House is pretty good at it relative to previous administrations, maybe. Trump was a unique player in this because of how everyone followed his Twitter feed obsessively. But outside of that, he wasn't very good at it. He wasn't utilizing all the different tools and technologies and reorienting the conversation. I think that there's a huge opportunity. People that run the Biden digital shop get that, but they just move slower. We here move slower, and that's something that there's a lot of room for. There's a lot of opportunity there.
Well, thank you for that. And I think that is a great note to end on. We need to move faster into 2022. Thank you so much for your time today and your ideas. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to review as we end 2021.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.